listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your resource to better understand and execute successful podcast ad campaigns. Hello and welcome to the Podcast Advertising Playbook. I'm your host, Heather Osgood, and I am joined today by Shira Atkins, the Global SVP of Business Development and Partnership at Acast. Shira, welcome to the show.
Thank you so much for having me. It's great to be here.
So you have had a very exciting end to your 2024, and I'm sure an exciting beginning to your 2025. Tell us a little bit kind of about Wonder Media and what has unfolded here in the recent months.
Yeah, of course. So we started the company about 6.5, almost 7 years ago now, which is wild to think about. And we have spent probably about the last 6 months of 2024 working on this deal with Acast, which was really exciting from the time we sort of met and realized like what could be together. It was really quite a fun process, also challenging. Selling a company is not easy, but lots of really good sort of creative conversations and conversations about synergy. And I have to say, since closing the deal about a month ago on January 2nd, we've already been able to embark on projects jointly that it really does feel like the 1 + 1 = 3 kind of thing. So it was a very happy ending to an amazing chapter. Started this company with a dear friend of mine, and we have this incredible group of producers and employees who work for us who will all be going over to Acast. So nothing much is changing on our side of things, except we have this wonderful new home.
Mm-hmm. Excellent. So what is so special about Wonder Media? You guys are very mission driven, correct?
Yes, we are. So we started the company initially to lift underrepresented voices. We began as a originals studio. We weren't really thinking about brands when we got into pod. And as we started to learn the landscape, that's when we realized that we needed to have multiple revenue streams, and that one of those streams could be working with brands and organizations to help them tell their stories. But because we were and continue to be mission driven, many of our clients over the years have also been similarly oriented. So we've worked with Planned Parenthood for many years, and Act Blue and the National Women's Law Center and different organizations like that, that make the branded content side of things feel also just really aligned with who we are and our ethos as a company.
And do you feel like the brands that you have worked with have particularly sought out your organization because they had maybe a mission-driven story to tell? Is that the angle that you guys have taken, as opposed to just like, hey, we're a great brand, we've got great stories to tell? Have you seen more of that happen as a result of what it is that you guys have created?
Yes and no. I think that over the past 6.5 years, there have obviously been many changes politically. And what I can say has been consistent is that the people who want to work with us, we're a team of all women who are mission driven, are specific kinds of people. And it doesn't necessarily matter if those people are working at other sort of like nonprofit organizations or working at like the biggest pharma company in the world. Like, we're attracting people that want to just work with other great people. But I will say, in terms of our production capabilities, we were always most interested in doing investigative style reporting and more intricate production design, that sort of thing. And that, I think, has also been a defining quality when brands come to us. We've, of course, done like straight interview style, thought leadership style podcasts. And also brands are looking to us to help them craft stories. So whether that's like the mission piece or the sort of production capabilities piece or some combination of the two, we'll never totally know, but I think they definitely all help.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, absolutely. What gap did you see in the market that kind of inspired you to create Wonder Media?
Yeah, I mean, in 2018, Lemonada didn't exist. There were not women-led podcasting companies. And if you
And
looked
not
at the
a
top,
whole lot of women listening to podcasts either,
not a
right?
whole,
Like
it,
the numbers were pretty skewed. I remember when I got into the space being like, wait, what? Like 75% of podcast listeners are men and like 90% of the hosts are men? Like it was weird, but sorry to interrupt, but I just thought it's kind of crazy.
Totally. And I remember like looking at the top charts, and it's not so much better now, I will say that, but like it
A
was all
little.
podcasts hosted by white men. Yeah, it's
Yeah,
definitely a little better. Mel Robbins creeping in there, that sort of
I
thing.
know.
But yeah, my business partner Jenny was working as a reporter at Bloomberg at the time,
Mm,
and her mom was running for Congress in North Carolina, where she's from. And she was like, I have this front row seat to this amazing moment in history. All of these women are running for office. Like, I really want to tell this story. And I feel like Bloomberg is maybe not the place to tell it. And so she had that kernel of that one idea and was just sort of like, there's not really a network, there's not really a platform. You know, Crooked existed, but like Crooked had not yet ventured into doing more sort of diverse perspectives. So we just went for it. And she knew much more about podcasting than I did at the time because she had actually hosted a podcast at Bloomberg. But it was my job to figure out, like, how do we sell this thing? How do we build an audience? And it was through those early conversations that we realized that we would need just more diverse set of revenue streams because we were never going to have mass scale and reach, both because of, as you said, who the listeners were in the podcast ecosystem at the time, and also that we were not attached to pre-existing network or pre-existing platform. So, you know, you could launch a podcast then and get 25,000 downloads per episode without spending any money. And that's what we got on Women Belong in the House, which was our first show. But even when you get 25,000 downloads per episode, like, that's not really a monetizable audience if you sell the traditional way. So that's what sort of gave us this window into, okay, we need to sell differently. We can't just be beholden to CPMs. We need to think about brand alignment and mission alignment and go from there.
Yeah. Yeah. No, makes a ton of sense. So with kind of this acquisition from Acast, you guys are forming the Acast Creative Studios. Tell us a little bit about what that will mean.
Yeah, so Acast has been doing amazing creative work and omni-channel work globally for some time now. But as more brands require a creative and custom approach, also thinking not just like beyond the CPM, I'm not just talking about like how you buy the stuff, but like how the stuff sort of lives in the world. Acast needs to be able to provide this at scale. So what Acast has right now is amazing shows and amazing creators and incredible reach. And what we will be adding is more sort of custom touch, production capability, audio, video, social, and then the sort of creative strategy and storytelling work that we've done for some of our existing clients. So what we want to build sort of builds on some of the work that has already happened for Acast, but in more of a sort of scaled approach.
Yeah, absolutely. That's awesome. And I know I've had a chance to kind of look into some of the different creative content strategies that Acast has developed. And I love the integration. And I think it's so special because there is so much power in what we're able to create and how we're able to tell a story for a brand without just saying, like, hey, we're a cool company, you should buy our stuff. And it sounds like you're going to be bringing a lot more of that to the Acast kind of ecosphere.
I certainly hope so. Yeah. And, you know, for some brands, that's like easier to do than for others. So, like, we've done a bunch of work with Nike, and Nike can do creative campaigns and doesn't need to talk about their shoes or their clothing. You just
Sure.
like hear a sound or you see an image and you know it's Nike and you're feeling empowered and feeling inspired to like get out there and run. And like Nike at this point, of course, they do care about their shoes, but they want people to be more active because they know that when people are more active and living healthy lifestyles, eventually they will also buy Nike. So that's like really fun, really fun creative storytelling to do. We've done lots of like mission oriented conversations with them. That's really about like uplifting women's voices. That's been phenomenal. But there are other brands where like you do need to talk about what the product is, but how can you do that in a way that is not that is cool and is not like beating people over the head with it. So integrating that with creators in an authentic manner and then infusing episodes with storytelling or integrated messaging or whatever it might be, like that's really the sweet spot that I think also you can charge a premium for and hopefully brands will also see results from.
Yeah, absolutely. I'm curious, how difficult is it to create an audience? So, as you mentioned in 2018, you could build a podcast and you could get listeners, and it was a lot of work. But now it feels like people start podcasts and it's like people don't listen and it's a lot of work to build an audience. And I think it has just a saturation point that we've reached in the industry where pre-COVID we didn't have as many podcasts, right? I mean, I'm sure it would be interesting to look at the exact numbers, but they increased by like millions within a couple of years. And so I guess I'm curious, when you're creating branded content, how do you make sure that you also have the audience to kind of warrant the brand's investment in the content creation?
Yeah, this is the question. And we, first of all, always work with our partners to align on goals from the outset. Because for some partners, the goal is mass awareness and scale. And if
Sure.
that's the goal, then that needs to inform the content that's being created, how the brand is integrated into the messaging around the podcast. Like if you slap the logo front and center, again, putting Nike to the side for a minute, but thinking about some of the other brands that we work with, it's going to just be really hard for them to break through. So like
Mhm.
if what they want is mass scale and reach and like being a hit, then you need to approach the content in a specific way. If on the other hand, you're working with like a B2B pharma brand, for example, or a financial services brand that has a very specific audience or customer segment that they're trying to reach, you work with the partner to identify like where are those listeners, how are we going to reach them, how many of them do we want to reach, and then construct a sort of media plan around that that
Mhm.
may involve targeted media, and it may involve lots of target, like it may involve a $300,000 paid media campaign, but again, we're just going to be like really targeted and really specific about that. So some of it is about setting expectations. I will also say that like there are tools that also original networks use to juice the charts or whatever that like may also matter to brands. Like it's just important to them to show, like, look at us. We can make a podcast that people listen to. That's like a good internal tool for like showing the head of marketing that like you've got cachet. Applying for awards. Like there's lots of things that matter to brands beyond just making sure that people listen to the content, which I hope doesn't sound cynical to say, but it is true that there's various KPIs that you need to consider when working with clients.
Yeah, absolutely. How would you define branded content? Like if there's a whole podcast and the last 10 seconds of it are, this podcast is brought to you by Nike. Is that branded? Like where are the lines there?
I wouldn't say that I have like an orthodox approach necessarily. And I'm someone who feels that the best branded content is content that you don't know is branded. So, brought to you by at the very end could be like a lovely way of indicating and winking that the whole time you were getting subliminal messaging, or that the brand was giving you like a delightful gift. And that's the branded content piece. So, I think the lines, and again, I'm not a journalist, so I can say this. Like, I'm fine with lines being blurred. For newsrooms, this is much less the case. And I could, of course, define for you like what branded content might look like in those instances. But we do a lot of work with Pfizer, and sometimes the host of the podcast will be a Pfizer representative. More often than not, they're outside of the Pfizer universe. We may, of course, like call upon experts within the Pfizer community, but we also don't need to. Like the point is that Pfizer wants to put out thought leadership. Pfizer wants
Sure.
to describe what innovations and drug discovery are looking like, or how AI is like enhancing cancer research or whatever it might be. That's all like net positive for a reputational podcast. So of course it is mega branded, like it's pharma and it's like highly regulated, but it's not like the Pfizer show. I think the best content is not that.
I love that. What would you say are some of the misconceptions that you see or have run into around branded content?
Hmm. I think it's a little bit of what I was just saying, which is that branded content has to be boring,
Mm.
or that branded content requires like the CEO of this company talking to the CEO of that company. We try not to work on projects like those.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. Do you find, and maybe this is not something you necessarily know, but do you find that the audience or the listeners of these branded shows typically already have some sort of like an affinity or relationship with the brand, and then listening to the podcast just builds on that? Like, I am a huge fan of this particular product, and like, yay, I'm so glad they have a podcast because I already am a huge fan. Or do you feel like it often is reaching a totally untapped or unfamiliar audience?
I think somewhere in the middle. And
Mhm.
again, it depends on what the
Sure.
content is and who the brand is. But like, for example, we used to work with this wonderful HR software company called Greenhouse. And Greenhouse is somewhat ubiquitous. Like basically Greenhouse and Lever are the main competitors. Like if you're like a startup or scale up company in the US, at least at this point, like most founders know about these two options. And they wanted to reach HR employees. They wanted to reach people that could be the buyers of their products. So
Mm-hmm.
probably most people knew about Greenhouse already that were listening to the podcast. And we had a very targeted marketing campaign to reach those stakeholders. But the stories were unique. You know, they weren't about how do I use Greenhouse. It's like, how do I hire with equity? How do I think about diversity in the workplace? You know, they're like important things to think about for people who work in HR. So that was a case where there's not necessarily passion for the product ahead of time. And I'm not sure, maybe it's like they were using it more for sales enablement than they were using it for customer retention, although I'm sure there was benefit there as well.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great answer. Would you classify branded content as advertising?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah. And
Yeah.
one of the questions I feel like I get a lot from brands that have never been in this space is like, should I start my own podcast? You know, and I'm always like, well, I don't know that that's the first thing I would jump into. Like maybe try to do some interviews, maybe sample buying some ads and then decide if you want to do a podcast because it does feel like a pretty weighty endeavor. But I don't know. What are your opinions on that?
So I agree that for most brands, it's nice to dip their toes in also because I think there's this misconception that the barrier to entry with podcasts is so low because just like anybody with a mic could set up an RSS feed and go. But really making something beautiful that people want to stick with for 6 to 8 episodes or whatever it might be is really hard. But yeah, like you asked if branded podcasts are advertising. Like I think they're advertising in the way that like all brand communication period is
Hmm.
advertising. In the way
Sure.
that like a logo is advertising. But the podcasts that we're making, for the most part, as I said before, like it's not necessarily even about direct conversion. Like we're not working with like DR brands for the most part. Like
Hmm.
we're thinking about brand awareness, thought leadership,
Hmm.
storytelling, lifting the curtain, what actually happens behind the scenes at GE or whatever. You're trying to relay institutional knowledge and institutional thinking. So, yes, I would say, like, for a brand that wants to do that sort of initiative and they're considering telling that story, they're probably looking at multiple avenues to do that. And if they want to do it in podcasts, the question that I usually come back with is like, okay, well, why audio as opposed to video or as opposed to targeted media or as opposed to digital or whatever else it might be? But if there's the heart for like a narrative, even if they haven't done podcast advertising before, I think it's okay, so long as there's the heart for the work.
Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I know that you mentioned you guys are going to be doing content creation in lots of different formats beyond just audio. And obviously, I'm a little biased, but I do feel like there's just something special about audio, and you can convey and tell a story so powerfully in audio that really isn't told in other formats. And I also think that you reach people in a different way with audio than with so many other forms of content. It, I feel like, makes a much stronger connection between the listener and the creator of the show than really, in my opinion, almost anything else, because there is just this intimate nature around podcasting. So, what I hear you saying is that brand has to really kind of resonate with that in order to want to step into creating a podcast.
Yes, absolutely. And obviously, I agree with you. That's why we started doing audio storytelling for brands. I think that the majority of the clients that we've worked with do understand that audio has that unique quality. And increasingly, as I was saying, you need to be where your customers are.
For sure.
And if you're doing the effort of doing a beautiful story in audio, there must be some sort of video extension,
Hmm.
whether it be for pure marketing purposes and or to leverage the content and just use it on other channels. So we want to like meet our customers also where they are and make sure that like we have the capabilities to help them with that. But we will always be audio first. I mean, I can't say always, but like I think so.
I always just go back to, I mean, obviously, everybody loves video and everybody loves social. Like, we're not saying that those aren't great platforms, but the time spent listening to podcasts is always just through the roof. Like when you compare different platforms, people spend a lot of time with audio. And I feel like in this place that we're at in history right now, where our attention spans have like gone to zero, the fact that somebody is going to spend 20 or 30 minutes with your content is pretty amazing.
It really is. It really is. And I think that's what helps us unlock budgets at some of the largest brands. They're like, we're going to spend how much money on making an audio file? And we're like, yes, but you're going to get 25 minutes of someone's time and attention. And yeah, I will say, like, when we think about metrics, I know I mentioned before identifying what the audience is, but we care a lot about listen through rates. It's a very core part of measuring our success.
Yeah. So much has changed in the podcast industry since 2018 when you guys started. Do you feel like there have been any substantial changes to branded content as opposed to just like the general podcast industry?
I feel like it's been fits and starts a little bit. Like
Mm,
when we were started, I can't remember if it was like in 2018 or shortly thereafter, GE did the message with Slate, which I still think is like probably the best branded podcast that was ever made. And it was immersive and audacious and like experiential. And there haven't been a lot of swings like that. We try to get our clients to do that sort of work all the time. And we've inched closer. Like we've certainly had a couple of projects that have been approximating the work that was done there. And, we also, over the past 6.5 years, went through a market downturn. Marketing budgets were slashed. Like there has been a little bit of hesitance to do things that totally push the envelope. I will say that like brand storytelling writ large, not just talking about audio right now, has, I think, totally increased. And you see that with like Tribeca now having their Tribeca X award. A colleague of mine was just at this brand storytelling institute at Sundance this past week, where brands like the North Face and John Deere and Home Depot are showing like 20-minute long films that are like truly narrative and like make you sob. And there is, P&G does a lot of this. Like there is a feeling that to move consumers and to break through the very crowded media landscape, like you need to tell stories from the heart. So I think that there's appetite, finding the right stakeholders, getting the right budgets to actually move that forward, I think has been a honestly pretty consistent challenge. But I will say that I think brands have understood that just as they must have a LinkedIn strategy, they must have an audio strategy. And
right.
whether that's full branded content or simply audio advertising, I mean, you just have to be in podcasting. And that is a change that I have seen. I have to do less explaining of like what we are.
Yeah.
That's
Yeah.
nice.
I love that. I think that that's such a good answer because I feel like when I started, I will never forget when I first started how many companies I would call and be like, "Do you want to advertise on a podcast?" And they would be like, "What is a podcast?" And I'm like, "Really? You don't know what that is?" Okay. So like I think like having to do less explaining is super helpful because if you have to sell them on the idea of like why they should like what it is and why they should want it before you sell them on the actual product, it's really difficult. So,
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, and even just this week, like apparently certain podcasters are going to be let into the press room at the White House. Like, yeah, obviously there's been this sort of like tidal shift in the
yeah.
new media landscape, which I think frankly has been amazing for our whole industry. But it's not new media anymore. I mean, it's new compared to the legacy print papers, but this is how people are consuming news and how they're feeling connected to different communities. Again, not having to do the explanation because it's so mainstream and no
Mhm.
longer just like the butt of a joke is a relief.
Yeah, I know. I know. And say what you will about the election, but I do think that there were a lot of strides made for
Totally.
podcasting in the election that were really positive for the industry. That it really did make it feel like, oh, we're grown up now. And we're, like you said, we're not just the butt of someone's joke. We're actually like a serious medium that people should be considering.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's sort of what we were just saying about like for a brand to get 25 minutes of attention, for a political candidate to get a 3 hour long interview, or to be able to like air a perspective in depth for a long time. I mean, these podcasts that have existed, like the Lex Friedman podcast and Joe Rogan and whatever, like it is monumentally impressive that they are able to like go so deep on these topics for such long periods of time and that people stay with it like over all of these years. It is again say what you will, politics aside, it is a public service. And that I think is like a reframe that is also helpful when brands think about like how to show up in podcasts like that.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Yeah, because there's that depth that you don't get. And like going back to what we were just saying about listen through and like time spent listening, you just go so much deeper. And when else in history, like, have we been able to spend 3 hours listening to a candidate? I don't know if that's ever happened, actually, now that I think about it, right? Maybe you could cobble together the sound bites, but again, they're sound bites. And being able to spend, I always feel like that when I'm listening to an interview, it's like you just spent that time with that person. And granted, you don't know how it was edited and things like that. There could be certainly manipulation of the content, but I know it's pretty fascinating.
Totally.
So, what kind of advice would you give to brands if they were thinking about entering like the space, or I'm interested in branded content, I'm just not really sure where to start? What are your thoughts?
Yeah, I mean, I think the very first thing is to define the audience. That would be my advice also to non-brands, to anybody starting a podcast, just figure out who you're talking
Or
to
marketing
first.
in general,
Marketing in general. I know
sometimes
it
people
seems
don't have that defined well, and you're like, oh, everyone is your customer, huh?
I still find it funny when I get on sales calls sometimes and I like say this and they're like, "Oh my God, I never thought of that." And you're like, "Really?"
Yeah.
So it sounds elementary, but like also doing the work of figuring out who the audience is
Yes.
within the podcast
Yes.
ecosystem is work. And then I would say defining what the format should be to tell the story that needs to be told is also essential. And for brands, often I'm recommending doing like 6 to 8 episodes. Sometimes we'll move it to 10 or 12, but it can't be so long. This is not necessarily going to be a habit that people are forming. We're telling like a specific series of things that are either tactically helpful or inspiring or lifting the curtain on some element of the brand or telling a narrative story. And that can be done succinctly in 20 to 25-minute long episodes over 6 to 8 episodes. And once you have the container for that, you can like put together an editorial outline. You can think about the right talent. You can think about the right kinds of guests. You can think about like the sonic mood board, like all of those elements that are so essential. But like without the container, there's nothing.
Yeah, yeah, I agree. And I love the advice. I think that even just if you're starting a podcast, period, I feel like a lot of times people get overwhelmed by this idea that I have to create one podcast episode a week for the rest of my life. And like that's too big a commitment. But I think, especially for branded content, like creating a season, creating that container and saying, we're not going to commit to doing an episode every week for a year. It's a limited series. And I also would, granted, I have never created a branded podcast, but I would assume that that gives you your kind of level of creativity that you're going to be able to invest, right? Because you can only come up with so many good ideas, and having that defined amount is, I'm sure, really helpful.
Absolutely. I will say there's one exception that I actually don't even know if they still exist, but I used to listen to this podcast all the time when we started the business. WBUR did a collaboration with with Reddit called Endless Thread. And
Oh,
it was a podcast that was like brought to you by Reddit. So this is like an interesting branded content thing. Brought to you by Reddit, but Reddit had no like interaction with the content itself, except that the whole episodes were these two hosts just going down the rabbit hole of like the annals of the internet of like what crazy thing pulling on Reddit threads. And it was amazing. It was just like a entertaining podcast. You were of course thinking about Reddit and it's brought to you by Reddit, but like there were also I think other ads like WBR could just sell it more broadly and that was always on and there's infinite content there. So that to me is like the perfect branded
sure,
content,
sure.
but it takes a very special type.
I know it does. Well, and Reddit is now extremely fortunate because they don't have to create branded podcasts because there are a million Reddit podcasts that exist that they don't have to pay for.
Exactly,
There are
exactly.
so many, but they're great. We represent one that's great. They're great. Yeah, I like Reddit shows. How do you see kind of the podcast advertising landscape for 2025? Is there anything that stands out to you that you think brands should be aware of?
I mean, I think it's really this question of like, what are the channels? Video is really big right now. Great to invest in video and think about video. it is okay, as I'm sure this is sort of meta, but like I'm sure we will pull out our little Zoom heads and like make some video out of that. That is like totally fine and great for so many brands. You don't need to like get a souped out studio and have three cameras and all of a sudden turn an audio first that's supposed to be intimate and supposed to be personal into a video shoot. So like thinking about like where the medium sort of starts and stops and how the content is going to be proliferated. I think in this moment, especially with all of the channels, I'm thinking about like TikTok and LinkedIn, and there are different strategies for all of them, just like how to stay focused and use them all appropriately. I think
Mm-hmm,
that's,
mm-hmm. Yeah, I love that. And I really do think that, like, you make such a good point. It's about looking at all the channels and what they can do for your brand and deciding where the best benefit is, but using that channel to the best of that channel's ability and instead of trying to make it something else.
yeah.
So, yeah. Awesome, Shira. Well, thank you so much for being on the show today. It was great chatting with you. If people would like to learn more about Acast Creative Studios, where's a good place for them to go?
Well, we don't yet have a website. That is coming. So in the meantime, they can go to the wondermedianetwork.com website or email me at shira.atkins@acast.com. And hopefully there will be a website very soon.
Excellent. Well, thanks for being on the show.
Thanks for having me.
Thank you for listening. I hope that you have enjoyed this episode. We don't talk a ton about branded content on the show, but it is a really powerful part of podcast advertising. So if you are thinking about having a branded podcast, I hope that you will think about reaching out to Acast or others that could help you with it. Thanks for listening, and we will catch you again next week. Thank you for listening to the Podcast Advertising Playbook, your source to a better understanding of the podcast advertising industry.